Some buildings never reach completion. Frozen mid-build, they stand as reminders of ambition cut short. Here's 15 of the most striking examples of buildings that just froze mid-build. Starting with number 15, the Ryugyong Hotel in North Korea. In Pyongyang, the Ryugyong Hotel has become one of the most notorious examples of a project that just froze mid-construction. Plans for the massive triangular skyscraper began in the 1980s when North Korea wanted to show its ambition and modernity. At 330 meters tall with 105 floors, it was designed to be the tallest hotel in the world, and construction began in 1987, and for several years the concrete frame rose quickly against the skyline. But by the early 1990s, the country was facing severe economic struggles. The collapse of the Soviet Union cut off crucial trade and financial support, and North Korea entered what it called the Arduous March, a period marked by famine and scarcity. With no resources to continue, work on the hotel had to stop in 1992. The concrete shell of the building just stood there abandoned for over 15 years, completely unfinished and without windows, plumbing, or even electrical. In 2008, construction briefly resumed when the Egyptian company Orascom, which was heavily involved in North Korea's telecommunications, agreed to install glass cladding on the exterior. This gave the building a modern look from the outside, but the interior was still unfinished. As of today, while the building is no longer the hollow gray shell it once was, it still doesn't function as a hotel, and it remains empty. This is a rare case where a building was largely completed in terms of structure, but it froze mid-build in terms of usability. Its nickname, the Hotel of Doom, captures the scale of the original vision and the decades-long reality of its standing idle. While technically not abandoned since work has sporadically restarted, it really never fulfilled its intended purpose, making it one of the clearest examples of a project frozen between ambition and reality. Number 14, the Sathorn Unique Tower. Bangkok's Sathorn Unique Tower is another example of a project that just was frozen. Construction began in the early 1990s, and it was intended to be one of the tallest and most luxurious towers in the city. The architect envisioned a 49-story building with amazing views of the river, designed in a style blending modern high-rise design with neoclassic details. At first, work progressed quickly, as Thailand's economy in the early 90s was booming. Bangkok was experiencing a wave of urban development and skyscrapers were rising across the city. However, the Asian financial crisis of 1997 brought construction to a halt. The Thai baht collapsed as their currency, credit markets froze, and many developers went bankrupt. By that point, the tower was already structurally complete with much of the concrete frame and even sections of the facade finished, but it lacked the interior work, utilities, and any final touches. Over time, it became an eerie presence on their skyline, often compared to a ghost tower. Some locals believe the site was cursed, particularly after a photographer captured some eerie images of the hollow structure back in the 2000s. Others noted its proximity to an old cemetery and temple, which of course further fueled stories of bad luck. In reality, the explanation was much more straightforward. The financial crash simply killed the funding and no investor wanted to restart it. Although the Thai economy recovered, occasional proposals were floated, but nothing moved forward. The tower became infamous in the 2010s as a destination for urban explorers. Tragically, there were also reports of accidents there and even suicides at the site, which reinforced that ghostly reputation. Today, it sits frozen mid-build. Its massive hollow concrete form still towers above the city, and it shows how fortunes turned during the 97 crash. More than 2 decades later, it's less an architectural achievement and more a symbol of collapse and urban stagnation. Number 13, Palacio de Justicia. The story of Bogotá's Palace of Justice is one of ambition, repeatedly frozen mid-build, interrupted by financial and political violence. The first modern attempt at building the Palace of Justice dates back to the early 20th, when Colombia's government wanted a structure that could house its Supreme Court. The earliest version began construction in the 1920s at the historic center of Bogotá, and this project, however, quickly ran into financial challenges. Colombia, in that period, was marked by economic instability, and the palace's construction was repeatedly halted due to lack of funding. A second iteration in the mid-20th century also faced serious obstacles. Construction moved forward, but in 1948, during El Bogotazo, a period of intense rioting sparked by an assassination of a political leader, the incomplete building was heavily damaged. Once again, the project stalled. For years, the remains of the half-built palace stood idle in the city center. The most infamous incident happened in 1985, when guerrillas from the M19 group seized the still unfinished palace, holding hostages and leading to a violent military response. The resulting fire and battle destroyed the building entirely, leaving only ruins. While the palace was eventually rebuilt in the 1990s in its current form, the repeated failures of the earlier versions remain one of Bogotá's starkest examples of buildings frozen in mid-construction. Its history shows how construction can freeze, not only because of economics, but also because of the wider conditions in society. The many times it was halted mid-build show how architecture can become entangled with history in ways that go far beyond bricks and mortar. Number 12. The New South China Mall. The New South China Mall is a peculiar case of a building that froze not during its physical construction, but almost immediately after opening. The project was conceived in the early 2000s by developer Hu Gairong. It was intended to be the largest shopping mall in the world by gross floor area, with space for more than 2,000 stores, along with entertainment like roller coasters, a replica of the Arc de Triomphe, and an indoor canal modeled after Venice. When the mall officially opened in 2005, construction had reached the exterior completion stage, and the grand architecture stood in place. But the interior work for most stores never progressed. Almost immediately after launch, it became clear that the project lacked sufficient demand. While the area was a major manufacturing hub, it didn't have the consumer base to support such a massive complex. Additionally, the location on the edge of the city made it difficult for people to access it easily. The building itself stood finished on the outside, but the interior corridors were eerily empty. Escalators led to floors with no shops. The entertainment features like the canal and amusement rides were installed but rarely used, and photographs from the late 2000s and early 2010s show huge silent hallways that look like a set for a dystopian film. Developers did make attempts to revive the mall, and construction crews occasionally returned to work on interiors or repurposed the areas for entertainment rather than retail. However, many of those efforts stalled as quickly as they began. The site became internationally known as a dead mall before it had ever really lived. In the mid-2010s, some new efforts were made to reposition the mall as an entertainment-focused center rather than a traditional retail hub, with amusement parks and dining replacing the thousands of empty storefronts. Those efforts had more success, but even today, parts of the massive structure remain underused. Number 11. The Sathorn Vista Tower. While the Sathorn Unique Tower is Bangkok's most famous ghost tower, it wasn't the only building project in the city to freeze mid-build during the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Sathorn Vista Tower, a separate development planned in the same economic boom, followed nearly an identical path. Construction on it began in the 1990s, when Bangkok's economy was rapidly expanding. It was designed as a high-rise luxury apartment complex with amazing views of their business district. By 1996, much of the structure was already standing. Then, the crisis hit. The collapse of the Thai baht triggered a wave of bankruptcies, and many real estate developers lost financing overnight. Unlike some other unfinished projects that were later revived, this one languished for a decade. By the early 2000s, the incomplete building had become part of the city's landscape of failed projects. Locals lumped it together with the Unique Tower as examples of the city's ghost towers. However, unlike Sathorn Unique, which became a tourist draw, Sathorn Vista remained largely ignored. The situation only changed in the 2010s when renewed economic growth made developers reconsider the abandoned sites. The project was eventually taken over, restructured, and repurposed, though the process was long and complicated due to legal disputes. While parts of the original building were never integrated into any new developments, the initial project as envisioned in the 90s never materialized. This story shows how a global financial event can just instantly freeze multiple projects, leaving behind concrete shells that remain frozen in time for years. Number 10. Plaza Rakyat. The Plaza Rakyat project in Kuala Lumpur is one of Southeast Asia's most notorious examples of a major construction effort freezing mid-build. It was conceived in the early 1990s and was intended to be a massive mixed-use development. It was located next to the city's Pudu Central bus terminal, making it a hub in downtown Kuala Lumpur. When ground was broken in '92, Malaysia was experiencing economic growth, and confidence in mega-developments was pretty high. The project's design included multiple towers, with the tallest planned to reach about 79 floors, and work initially moved quickly, with the foundations laid and several concrete structures rising into place. But then, the '97 Asian financial crisis, which affected much of the region, brought the project to a halt. At that point, some of the main structures had already been partially built, including podium levels and several tower bases, but for the next 2 decades, the incomplete shells stood untouched. The abandoned site became a striking landmark there in Kuala Lumpur. For years, commuters passing through the adjacent bus terminal could look up and see the remains of what was once supposed to be one of the city's premier developments. Various developers expressed interest in completing the project, but ownership disputes, debt issues, and the scale of the redevelopment kept progress at a standstill. In the 2010s, there were renewed efforts to bring the plaza back to life with proposals to redesign. The Malaysian government became involved, pressuring for a resolution because the site was considered an eyesore in an otherwise rapidly modernizing city. As of today, though, the original vision has long been abandoned. Half-completed buildings that have stood for nearly 3 decades reflect the scale of Malaysia's ambitions during its boom years. Number 9. The Chicago Spire. Few unfinished buildings in the world have generated as much attention, debate, and disappointment as the Chicago Spire. Planned as the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, its story is a case study in how ambition can collide with finance, leaving behind nothing more than a deep concrete hole in the ground. The Spire was conceived during the early 2000s real estate boom, when cities across the world were competing to build taller and more dramatic skyscrapers. In 2005, an Irish developer announced plans for a twisting 2,000-foot tower on the banks of the Chicago River near Lake Michigan. The building was originally designed by the Spanish architect Santiago Calatrava, known for his futuristic and sculptural works. His design called for a slender corkscrew-shaped tower that would taper as it rose, completing a full 360-degree twist from base to top. With 150 floors, it was intended primarily as a luxury residential building containing more than 1,200 condominiums. Early interest was strong, as Chicago had a reputation for innovation, and its skyline already had icons like the Willis Tower, formerly the Sears Tower, and the John Hancock Center. Construction began in 2007, and the hole alone was notable, a deep round caisson that looked like an inverted tower descending deep into the ground to support the ordinary height. But before the tower could begin rising, the financial crisis of 2008 struck. The housing market collapsed, credit dried up, and the developer's financing evaporated. Buyers who had signed up for early units pulled out, leaving the project without the sales momentum it needed. By late 2008, construction had stopped, with only the foundation in place. That deep circular hole, fenced off and left idle, was visible to commuters, tourists, and residents. Locals referred to it as the world's most expensive hole. For some, it represented lost opportunity. For others, it was a cautionary tale of overreach and speculation. For a time, developer Related Midwest controlled the site, and there were rumors that the Spire might be revived in some form, yet by the mid-2010s it was clear the original vision was dead. Unlike other frozen projects that leave behind half-completed towers, this Spire left behind only a foundation, but one so distinctive and so well-publicized that it became famous on its own. Its failure is remembered not only as a local disappointment, but as part of a broader global narrative of projects that were derailed by the 2008 crash. Number 8. Palacio de Congresos de Oviedo. In the Spanish city of Oviedo, another project by Santiago Calatrava shows how architectural vision can outpace practical execution. Known as the Palacio de Congresos de Oviedo, or the Palacio de Calatrava, this complex was originally planned as a multi-use convention center. Work began in the early 2000s when Oviedo's government commissioned Calatrava to design a new landmark. The design was typically dramatic, a giant sweeping structure resembling a bird with wings outstretched, created from white concrete and steel. Construction did advance quickly at first, and by the mid-2000s, the main structural elements were in place. The enormous curved roof with those rib-like supports became one of the most recognizable silhouettes in the city. But serious problems soon emerged. Costs ballooned far beyond initial budgets, with overruns in the hundreds of millions of euros. Then, the 2008 financial crisis further strained the finances of both the city and the developer, and by 2010, construction had largely stopped. Residents of Oviedo nicknamed the project Calatrava's Ruin, reflecting both its unfinished state and the controversy surrounding its costs. It also faced some technical issues. Cracks appeared in parts of the structure, which raised questions about the durability of the design. Repairs added further costs to an already financially troubled project, and legal battles ensued, with Calatrava himself facing criticism for designs that some claimed were impractical and overly expensive to build. Large areas here still remain empty or underused, giving the structure an unfinished character. The building dominates the section of Oviedo, and it stands as an example of the risks of commissioning this monumental architecture without clear economic sustainability. To this day, it represents ambition and failure. It's an extraordinary visual presence, but a deeply flawed project. Moving on to number 7, the Torre de David. The Torre de David is one of the most striking examples of a skyscraper frozen in mid-build. Located in Caracas, Venezuela, it was intended to be a symbol of modern finance in the early 90s, but instead became known worldwide as a half-finished tower that turned into a massive squat. The project began in 1990 under Venezuelan banker and investor David Brillenberg. His vision was to build a cutting-edge financial center in the heart of Caracas, complete with multiple towers, luxury offices, and facilities that would rival those financial districts in major cities. The centerpiece was to be a 190-meter-tall skyscraper with 45 floors. Construction advanced quickly in the early years. The concrete structure of the main tower was largely completed, along with few other small towers that made up the complex. By 1993, it was about 60% finished, but then the Venezuelan banking crisis hit. Brillenberg himself died in 93, and soon after, his financial empire collapsed. For over a decade, the project stood frozen mid-build. But the story took a dramatic turn in the 2000s. Amid Venezuela's worsening housing crisis, squatters began moving into the abandoned tower. By 2007, thousands of people, estimates range from anywhere between 2,000 to 5,000, had taken up residence inside this unfinished skyscraper. With the elevators never installed, residents had to use motorcycles on ramps to move between the lower floors and walked long flights of stairs to reach the higher levels. Well, despite its improvised nature, the community in the sky, as it became known, became remarkably well organized. Residents formed councils to manage services, set up shops and barbershops, and even tapped into electricity and water from the city below. Then, international media began to take notice, dubbing the Torre de David the world's tallest squat. Documentaries and photo essays portrayed the unusual life inside, and for many outsiders, it became a symbol of Venezuela's economic decline. In 2014, the Venezuelan government evacuated the building, citing safety concerns. Residents were relocated to state-provided housing outside of Caracas, and since then, it's remained empty. Plans to redevelop the site have been floated, but none have advanced meaningfully. Number 6. The Volkshalle. The Volkshalle, or People's Hall, is one of the most famous examples of a building that never made it. Conceived during Nazi Germany as part of Hitler's plan to redesign Berlin into a monumental new capital called Germania, this hall was intended to be the largest dome structure in the world. The concept was developed by Hitler's chief architect Albert Spire in the late 1930s. The Volkshalle was to serve as the centerpiece of Germania, which symbolized the supposed greatness of the Third Reich. The hall's dome was planned to be 290 meters high and 250 meters in diameter, dwarfing even St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. It was going to be designed to hold up to 180,000 people for rallies, speeches, and ceremonies. Prep work began in Berlin near the Reichstag in 1938. Engineers began clearing land and conducting soil tests. Spire later noted that one of the test domes leaked and caused condensation problems. But by the outbreak of World War II in 1939, progress was halted. Resources were diverted to the war effort and labor was redirected. By 1943, even Spire admitted that the project was no longer feasible. In the post-war period, Allied forces discovered documents, models, and blueprints that revealed the scale of this thing. Many historians have since studied the project as an example of the grandiose ambitions of the Nazi regime and its reliance on architecture as propaganda. Today, no trace of it exists on the surface. The site where it was to be built is now part of the government district. Models of the hall can be seen in museums, giving a sense of the scale of what was planned. Although it never rose into the skyline, the Volkshalle remains one of history's most infamous frozen projects. In this case, the project froze before it even had the chance to fail structurally. The realities of war stopped it in its tracks, leaving behind one of the most memorable what-could-have-been stories in architectural history. Number 5. The Palace of the Soviets. The Palace of the Soviets was maybe the most ambitious project ever proposed in the Soviet Union. Planned as a colossal government complex in Moscow, it was designed to be taller than the Empire State Building and crowned with a massive statue of Vladimir Lenin. Although construction began in the 1930s, it was halted by World War II and never resumed in its original form. The idea for the palace came out of a 1931 architectural competition ordered by Joseph Stalin. The Soviet leadership wanted a building that would symbolize the might of communism and outshine the monumental architecture of the capitalist world. The competition drew submissions from leading Soviet architects. Ultimately, the winning design was produced by Boris Iofan, with later modifications overseen by Stalin himself. Iofan's plan called for a skyscraper rising over 1,300 feet, topped by a 100-meter-tall statue of Lenin pointing towards the future. Construction began in 1937 on the site of the demolished Cathedral of Christ the Savior. Workers poured massive foundations, and photographs from the late 1930s show cranes and scaffolding surrounding the emerging skeleton. But when World War II broke out in 1941, construction stopped. The steel framework that had been erected was dismantled and used for military fortifications and bridges. By the end of the war, the Palace of the Soviets existed only as a set of foundations and a partially completed basement. After the war, the Soviet Union faced the task of rebuilding cities devastated by fighting. Resources had to be directed towards housing and infrastructure. Then in the 1950s, the idea was officially abandoned. The foundations were converted into the world's largest open-air swimming pool, known as the Moskva Pool, which operated until the 1990s. The story of this one illustrates how architecture will serve as a mirror of political ambition. Conceived as a symbol of Soviet power, it was frozen mid-build and then cannibalized for wartime needs. It still is one of the most iconic unfinished projects of the 20th century, remembered more for its absence than for anything that was actually built. Number 4. Hotel Ukraina. In the case of the Hotel Ukraina in Tbilisi, later known as the Iveria Hotel, and eventually redeveloped as the Radisson Blu Iveria, shows a project that can be frozen mid-build only to be repurposed and completed decades later in a completely different form. The story starts in the 1960s, when Georgia was still part of the Soviet Union. The Soviet government commissioned a major new hotel in central Tbilisi to serve foreign visitors, government delegations, and tourists, and construction began in 1967. The design followed the modernist aesthetic of the era, a rectangular tower with clean lines rising 22 stories. Work slowed repeatedly, and while the concrete frame for the tower was completed by the early 70s, interior finishing dragged on for years. At several points, the construction had to be halted altogether, leaving the building as a concrete shell in the middle of the capital. Locals nicknamed it the Frozen Hotel, since the exterior suggested progress, but while the interior remained unusable. It wasn't until 1976 that it was finally opened, merely after a decade of work. Even then, it lacked some of the facilities originally promised. The hotel operated under the name Hotel Iveria for many years, but its troubled construction meant it carried a reputation for delay. Of course, in the early 1990s, thousands of refugees displaced by conflicts were housed in the unfinished or underused hotel. Once again, the building froze in half a functional state. In the 2000s, as Georgia's economy began to recover, the hotel was finally redeveloped, the old Soviet interiors were gutted, and the building was transformed into the Radisson Blu Iveria. This hotel case demonstrates that frozen construction isn't always permanent. Some projects eventually come back to life, though often in ways that are very different from what their original builders intended. Each stage of its existence revealed something about the times in which it stood half-finished. Number 3. The Hassan Tower. The Hassan Tower in Rabat, Morocco, is one of the earliest and most enduring examples of a building frozen in mid-construction. The project began in 1195 under the Almohad Caliph Yaqub al-Mansur. At the height of their power, the Almohads controlled a huge empire stretching across North Africa and into Spain. Al-Mansur wanted to build a mosque in his capital, Rabat. The mosque would symbolize his authority, rival the great mosques of Cordoba, and cement Rabat as a political center. The centerpiece of the mosque complex was to be the minaret known as the Hassan Tower. The design followed architectural traditions with a square plan and a gradual spiral ramp inside that would allow riders on horseback to ascend. If completed, the tower was projected to rise more than 80 meters. That's taller than the famous Giralda of Seville, which had been constructed just decades earlier under the same dynasty. In 1199, Al-Mansur died suddenly, and without his leadership, the dynasty quickly weakened. Work on the mosque and tower stopped immediately, and the half-finished structures were left as they stood. The tower dominated Rabat's skyline, but rose only half as tall as intended. The mosque's courtyard, which was supposed to hold thousands of worshippers, was filled with unfinished columns, and over time, earthquakes damaged parts of the site, and the stone was carried away for use in other buildings. Yet even in its unfinished state, the tower did become iconic. Its reddish sandstone glows in the sun, and the scale gives a sense of the ambition that once drove its construction. But today, the tower and the remains of the mosque stand alongside the mausoleum of Muhammad V, built in the 20th century, forming one of Rabat's most important landmarks. Number 2. Woodchester Mansion. When most people think of unfinished buildings, they typically think of modern skyscrapers that are halted during economic downturns, or maybe ambitious state projects frozen by politics. Yet one of the most fascinating ones lies deep in the English countryside, hidden among the wooded hills of Gloucestershire. Woodchester Mansion looks at first glance like any other Victorian Gothic country house. But step inside and the illusion is shattered. Rooms are roofless, walls stop mid-construction, and staircases lead to nowhere. Scaffolding left behind by masons 150 years ago still cling to the stone. It's a house caught in time, a building that froze mid-build in the 19th century. The story of the mansion begins with William Lee, a wealthy London businessman. Born in 1802, Lee had built his fortune in the Midlands before turning his attention to spiritual and architectural pursuits. Lee purchased Woodchester Park Estate, a secluded valley near Stroud, and soon decided that its existing Georgian mansion didn't suit his taste. He ordered it demolished and began planning a new house that would rival the great Gothic revival mansions of the era. Construction began in 1858. Handsome's design was ambitious, a neo-Gothic house of honey-colored Cotswold stone. From the outside, the house was to appear complete and imposing, with tall chimneys, gables, and a large mullioned window overlooking the valley. Inside, the design called for vaulted ceilings, elaborate stone carvings, and an internal chapel, features that reflected Lee's Catholic devotion. For a time, work progressed smoothly. Stonemasons carved the delicate tracery for windows and installed the soaring arches in the Great Hall. But behind the scenes, there were problems. The first and foremost was money. Lee had wealth, but his spending was extravagant, and Woodchester Mansion was only one of several expensive projects he pursued. Lee poured his fortune into another project, but the bills mounted faster than he could pay them. A second problem was his perfectionism. Accounts from the time suggest he was difficult to please, frequently changing his mind about details, and those delays added to further costs and disrupted the progress. By the mid-1860s, after nearly a decade of work, the house was still unfinished. Then in 1873, William Lee died. With his death, construction here at the mansion stopped entirely. Its unfinished state is what makes it unique. Most historic houses are preserved as they were completed, offering a polished version of the past. Woodchester, by contrast, reveals the process of building itself. For historians and architects, it's an invaluable resource. Over the decades, the house passed through various owners, none of whom invested in completing it. In the 20th century, the building was even repurposed briefly for military use. During World War II, the estate around the mansion was used by Allied forces for training. Local legends grew up around the abandoned mansion too. Its eerie, half-built interiors gave it a reputation of a haunted house. Tales circulated of ghostly monks, strange lights, and unexplained noises. Paranormal investigators have visited the site many times, and it's often cited as one of the most haunted places in England. Whether or not the ghost stories are true, though, the building's unfinished state certainly contributes to that unsettling atmosphere. Number 1. MetLife North Building. New York City has long been a place where ambition will collide with reality. Skyscrapers rise in quick succession, each one competing for attention and height, only for economic downturns or shifting priorities to sometimes leave projects permanently unfinished. Among the most striking examples of this is the MetLife North Building, originally conceived in the late 1920s as the tallest skyscraper in the world. MetLife Insurance Company was founded in 1868 and had by the early 20th century grown into one of the largest insurance firms in the world. Its headquarters at 1 Madison Avenue was already iconic. In 1909, the company that completed the MetLife Tower, a 700-foot-tall skyscraper modeled after the Campanile in Venice. At the time, it was the tallest building in the world, briefly holding that record before being surpassed by the Woolworth Building in 1913. But MetLife's executives were not content. By the 1920s, just as New York entered its most aggressive era of skyscraper building, the company wanted to outdo not just its earlier tower, but every building in existence. In 1928, plans were announced for the MetLife North Building, to be erected directly north of the original tower. The concept was nothing short of staggering, a 100-story skyscraper rising to about 1,300 feet, making it taller than any building then or even planned. At the time when the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building were entering their own height race, the MetLife North Building was designed to eclipse them all. The plan called for a sleek Art Deco style, a monolithic giant that would tower over Midtown. Its footprint would stretch across an entire city block. At its intended height, it would have cast a shadow across Madison Square Park and dominated the skyline. Construction began in 1928 with enormous fanfare, but in 1929, everything changed. The stock market crash that October ushered in the Great Depression, a global financial crisis that brought construction in New York to a halt. Suddenly, the idea of erecting a 100-story office tower for an insurance company seemed not only financially impossible, but socially tone-deaf. Rather than abandoning the project outright, MetLife scaled it back drastically. Construction slowed and halted about 29 stories in 1933, and what had been envisioned as the tallest building in the world became, instead, a massive but squat block, a base waiting for a tower that would never rise. Even after the Depression ended, the project was never revived. By the 50s and 60s, the trend in office design had shifted away from super-tall towers toward modernist glass slabs, and MetLife itself no longer needed the same symbolic show of power. The base, however, remained in use and became part of the company's growing complex around Madison Square. In the historical context, the North Building does represent the abrupt end of New York 1920s skyscraper race. The Chrysler Building and the Empire State both reached completion just before the Depression fully set in, each briefly holding the title of the world's tallest. Over the decades, the building has continued to serve some practical purposes. In the 2000s, the site was included in plans for renovation and modernization of MetLife's headquarters, but the idea of ever completing the tower to its original height was never even considered. Urban historians often point to the North Building as a case study in overbuilding. The steel skeleton, designed for 100 floors, supports 29. Now, this has led to an unusually spacious and sturdy office floors compared to other buildings of the same height. The mismatch between its potential and its actual form makes it unique among New York skyscrapers.